From Ricochet Media, this is Unpacking the News, a weekly series of conversations highlighting Canadian cultural and political diversity from coast to coast. I'm Andre Goulet. For the price of a cup of coffee, you can help keep this show weekly through summer 2018. Go to patreon.com/unpackingthenews to get access to interviews and episodes you won't find anywhere else. Thanks to Daniel B., Wendy Crawford, and YBAH2X05 for supporting this podcast. Thanks, folks. And on this episode, Stephen Harper's back, and he's making big bank in corporate consulting and grifting on the right-wing speakers circuit, a post-politics career that's bringing him into contact with a lot of pretty problematic pals. My childhood chum, Brad Goertz, last spoke to this show in August 2017 about the unconventional social democracy of Rachel Notley's Alberta NDP, and he messaged me a really pissed off text this week to ask why the fuck Harper was speaking to an Iranian exile group that advocates for the violent overthrow of the Iranian government. I had no idea, so with the very excellent help of Jason Makusoff's work in Maclean's magazine this week, we dug into just what the fuck the 22nd Prime Minister of Canada has been up to lately. Brad joins me from Edmonton. Hey, dude.
Hey, guy.
How old were we when Harper took office? This would have been like 2006?
Yeah, I guess like 28.
Late 20s, right. And his era in office seemed like an eternity. But since quitting Parliament in 2016 and returning to Calgary, his adopted hometown, Stephen Harper's been a busy guy. Earlier this month, the sixth longest-serving Prime Minister of Canada created a stir when he attended a secret meeting at the White House with Trump economic advisor Larry Kudlow without informing the Canadian government. So he's totally freelancing. Nobody knows what these two talked about behind closed doors. What do you think? What could they have been discussing?
I don't know. How to make some money. I think Harper needs a new pool.
Right, and he's been largely out of sight since losing the 2015 election. I know he published a book on hockey and the Toronto Maple Leafs, but then he was basically just off script. And like a lot of Canadians, I hadn't thought a lot about what he'd been up to until he re-entered the public eye with this covert White House meeting. And then when he was criticized for giving a speech to an Iranian exile organization. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think, the last time I heard of him before this, he was sort of defending NAFTA. But yeah, then I heard him on, there was they played some tape of him speaking and sort of getting a bit croaky, trying to rally the Iranians in support of the MEK. It's a political militant group that advocates the violent overthrow of Iran's government, which I don't know that I have any opinions one way or the other on Iran, but it just seemed like a really strange thing because the first thing I thought of was that the only other time I've heard about the MEK was Harper going on about how they're bad guys and how they're on the wrong side of morality. So they're headquartered in Iraq from 86 to 2016. I think they were taken off the terrorist list in 2012.
So the People's Mujahedin of Iran, a radical, formerly described as a terrorist organization, and Harper is being paid to speak to them and advocating for regime change. Okay, so I want to dig into some other under-the-radar stuff that he's been up to over the last year and a half, and all of this information sourced from Jason Makusoff's really excellent and exhaustively researched piece out this week at Maclean's. So in February of this year, he becomes chairman of the International Democrat Union. Who are they? What's that?
Yeah, it's a bunch of like right-wing dirtbags. It's the League of Right of Center Parties, founded during the wonderful times when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were running things.
And what did he tweet?
He tweets a congratulatory note to Hungary's far-right Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Orban's Hungarian Civic Alliance, or Fidesz. They're a member party of the Union. He was recently reelected to a fourth term. Orban and Fidesz actively target immigrants and minorities and pursue what they call an illiberal democracy policy, includes weakening civil institutions.
Wow, that's so cool. And incidentally, Harper also, a couple months later, was spotted at the World Curling Championships in Las Vegas. So he's staying busy. And besides the secret White House visit, the Iranian exile radicals speech, and this very public support of a leading politician of Europe's far right, he's earning, I guess, like $50,000 per appearance, American currency, that's greenbacks, green gold, on the right-wing speaking circuit. So this month, saw Harper attend a political retreat in Utah, organized by 2012 Republican candidate for president Mitt Romney. Harper spoke at a $1,000 a plate fundraiser at an Israeli college in Toronto. He gave a speech at Chamber of Commerce dinners in Lloydminster, Saskatchewan, and Leduc, Alberta. And earlier this year, he was at a policy talk in New Delhi. He also spoke at a mortgage professionals conference in Niagara Falls, Ontario. So all that, plus he's given talks to at least 10 Israel-related events since leaving Parliament in 2016. Harper loves Israel, and I totally forgot that. It's true, isn't it?
He's been banging that Israel drum for a long time. But like you said, he's freelancing. If there's money, I think he'll go for it.
Yeah, like it's always been evident that he's a huge fan of Israel, and the Canadian government's foreign policy consistently made that clear when Harper was in office. So him continuing this advocacy as he's transitioned to a life beyond politics, even though it's still clearly a political life, isn't really surprising. Tell us about the Friends of Israel initiative. He's the director of that. What's that?
Yeah, he's the director of the Friends of Israel Initiative. It's a group of former political leaders, which until recently included White House advisor and extremist, and just a real goofball, John Bolton. It was through this organization they co-signed that. There was that full-page ad in the New York Times praising Trump's pulling out of the Iran nuclear accord. In spite of, when you ask anyone who actually has boots on the ground, Iran was completely following along with the deal. They were not doing anything untoward. So these ghouls got together, and Bolton especially is a scary guy.
Right, and this has been a big Netanyahu project to destroy the nuclear accord with Iran. So when we think about sort of some of the background to Israel and to the connections between particularly the American right, but also the Canadian right, like, why is Harper an Israel booster? I mean, what besides the cash incentive is in it for the right wing? What connections can we make?
I honestly don't know. I mean, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, it's a non-governmental organization, an NGO, tasked with strengthening connections between the powerful evangelical Christian movement and the state of Israel. I was listening to a program recently just going on about how you kind of can't get elected in the United States unless you go on being pro-Israel.
Yeah, exactly. I want to talk about that. The International Fellowship of Christians and Jews was founded in 1983, and he gave the keynote at Mar-a-Lago, the winter White House, the Trump residence. And at the speech, he criticized anti-Semitism on campus and described unequivocal support for Israel as, quote, plainly and simply the right thing to do. And the chairman of the board of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, by the way, is none other than Stockwell Day, who I thought literally he had turned into a punchline. I didn't know he actually still existed. So I was totally surprised. What did you think about that really, really deep cut?
Well, honestly, hearing him talking about how taking this sort of a really one-sided approach to Israel, and I just keep thinking about that idea, like you said, plainly and simply the right thing to do. But if you're paying attention at all to what's going on in Palestine right now, just the bald racism of the Israelis, and I don't think it's unfair to call it genocidal action that's happening there, like having IDF snipers taking out doctors that are wearing Red Cross uniforms. And Harper apparently has no problem with that, but he doesn't like it if you're Iran. Like if you're the wrong color in the Middle East, you're going to have, and if you're not paying Harper $50,000 a pop.
One of the reasons Harper's out there banging the drum, as you put it so correctly, and banging it so consistently, is that he's promoting an upcoming book, which is coming out on October 16th. It's called Right Here, Right Now, Politics and Leadership in the Age of Disruption.
Is that a Pepsi commercial?
Oh, exactly right. I'm positive that the title is inspired by the early 90s hit single Right Here, Right Now from British alternative rock band Jesus Jones. So since leaving office, one thing I had heard about, like sort of post-hockey book, but before he started making the news pretty frequently, is that he started a consulting gig. What can you tell us about Harper and Associates?
Probably the most recent thing is this Castere Energy, based out of Calgary. They're preparing to negotiate a mining lease on an enormous amount of Jordanian oil shale. There are restrictions on former Canadian ministers and senior aides lobbying the government. Harper's own government that enacted a 5-year lobbying ban. But there aren't any restrictions for Canadian leaders representing companies to foreign governments abroad. So I don't know how I feel about that. If he wants to go, he's just like a merc, right? He's a mercenary. So we don't know if Harper and Associates has been speaking directly to Jordanian officials about Castere's oil plans.
But according to the CEO of Questar, he said that they had sort of rented out Harper for, quote, strategic advice on how to position ourselves to minimize our political risk. That's what we hired him for. He added that, does Harper have a lot of contacts in the region? Of course he does. But former finance minister and Joe Oliver, who I think is a Bay Street lizard person, says that Harper's an ethical guy and that he's not making decisions based on the economic factors, i.e. the payola. So in other words, he's not in it to get rich. He is in it to advance an ideological agenda. And actually, that sounds right to me because Harper has always been someone with his eye strictly on the prize. He's a really intelligent person. It's just that his moral compass is completely skewed towards some of the most broken ideology that is possible. So plus he's going to get pretty rich, right? So what do you think? Do you think it's the payday, or is it the ideology that is compelling Stephen Harper?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it's a payday. I'm sure if he wasn't getting paid, he wouldn't be getting up in the morning. But I also think he's a robot, and he's one of those sort of dark kind of economist robots. I think he is genuinely an ideologue. And I think his morality is more based on what's the thing that you can win rather than what's the right thing to do. I think we saw that. I think he actually would have liked to have gotten rid of abortion, but he understood that it wasn't politically a good idea if you're the prime minister. And then you see how he exercised control over the party, when he was leader.
One fucked up thing is watching him kind of be the right man at the right time. That's what it looks like when I started looking into these different speeches and where he's choosing to put his energies as he becomes more engaged in the actual issues of the day. He's all prepared to be this elder statesman who's still young enough and hungry enough to stir all kinds of shit up. And what was really interesting in the Makusoff piece at Maclean's was he quoted a former Harper aide named Andre Goulet, who lives in England now. And Goulet had an interesting perspective. He thinks that Harper's more interested in what foreign audiences think of his advocacy work and that he isn't concerned with what Canadians think of him. Quote McDougall, I think he, quite frankly, couldn't give a shit what people in Canada think. He's not speaking to that audience. And to me, this makes so much sense because Harper is nothing if not an aloof imperial douche, right? He doesn't care what the Canadian public thinks. He definitely didn't care what the Canadian public thought when he was actually in power for nearly a decade. This is a person who was always completely comfortable refusing absolutely to be held accountable for his actions and ignoring his critics, which is why he was such a deeply frustrating political leader in Canada. Yeah, he did the same fucking thing when he was a prime minister, didn't he?
Yeah, totally. And even now, his perspective on the Trump and Brexit era, the reactionary populism that he's super in favor of over there. He believes we should look at the Eurosceptics and nationalists who win not as threats to democracy, but he's sort of welcoming them as a natural outcome of the system. No mention of how Islamophobia and anti-immigration sentiment fuels these movements.
Well, that's fun. That's kind of funny because it's this week that we've seen, I don't know if you were reading about it in Ontario, the 15 days in office, and Premier Doug Ford has just already succeeded in sort of blowing up the social contract because the federal minister for immigration, I forget his name at the moment, but he was basically pushing back at a premier's meeting against Ford's representative for immigration, and he called her attitudes anti-Canadian because she was referring to asylum seekers with kind of some of this charged negative language that we read about. So what's happening today in Ontario is just this flare-up of the sort of classic Harper conservatism that we had lived with for many, many years. One thing that he said about his support for Euroscepticism and this sort of nationalism in Europe, including Brexit, is he said that if we try to delegitimize all unconventional choices as anti-democratic, then I think we're going to go down equally dangerous ground. And here he's alluding to socialism, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sounds like it. I mean, I think Harper's just following the money. I think he's an opportunist.
Okay, to sort of begin wrapping up here, Jason Makusoff attended these off-the-record Q&A sessions with Harper at the Chamber of Commerce speeches in Lloydminster and in Leduc. And I wanted to just kind of quote a couple of these things because I think they are pretty incisive in explaining the man's mind a bit. So here's what Harper, in his own words, had to say about pipelines. Quote, "They rescinded, the Liberal Trudeau government, without any hearing whatsoever, the Northern Gateway approval. They changed the rules so the Energy East pipeline could never get through the process no matter what. And now they have stepped back and let people believe outside this country that if there are protests around the Kinder Morgan pipeline, that it can't get built. And now they've stepped in to buy it with no intention of building it, just to convince us, by the way, that they're not blocking the project. So the problem's not the process. The problem's not First Nations. The problem is a government that does not support the energy sector. And I think it's frankly disgraceful and unforgivable that we have a federal government that thinks it can be against key industries in the Western Canadian economy." So this would play pretty well with prairie audiences, but it's total bullshit, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think it's true that the Liberals don't have an intention of actually building the pipeline. I mean, my personal opinion is that they should build it and then keep it. I think it should be a nationalized project. You just get into this territory where, and actually I should take that back too. He's an opportunist, like he'll kind of float with the breeze, but as long as that breeze is blowing to the right. I think he's a genuine ideologue, Harper. And I think it doesn't really matter how nasty it looks or how much it might look like Islamophobia or how much it might look like racism or socialism, which I think Harper would probably rather be accused of being an Islamophobe than a socialist.
He also weighed in on Trump, about whom he said, "I've never met Mr. Trump. We do have a lot of mutual friends and acquaintances. I know many of the people in his cabinet and who work for him. He's definitely an interesting and complex guy. But look, I don't think, and I'm not going to tell you for a moment based on what I know, Trump would be an easy person to do business with. But I can also tell you, I think he's actually a reasonably easy person to assess." Okay, not a lot very interesting there. It's pretty diplomatic language. But here's what he had to say about Canada-U.S. relations. "On the Keystone Pipeline, on the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, on the withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal, on the heightened fight against ISIS and terrorists in the Middle East, I thought these were all perfect opportunities for us to demonstrate that we're a real partner with the United States. It's great to be a buddy, but you don't get into these kinds of conflicts if you're really showing you're valuable." And he's talking here about the recent conflicts between Trump and Trudeau. Do you think that's accurate?
Do I think it's accurate?
Let me rephrase that. You just stopped completely. You're like, I don't know what he's talking about. So when he's saying that, if we did all these things, then there wouldn't be trouble with Trump. Is that accurate?
Like the idea that you're not going to have softwood tariffs and you're not going to have steel and aluminum tariffs if you just play ball?
Yeah.
Maybe.
What? No way. Because Trump would be like an obscene idiot no matter what Trudeau did. Like, there's no right way to deal with this guy. So I thought with this one part in particular, Harper was being really just like purposefully naive.
He's protecting his grift, right? Like, he's got to stay in that circle so he can keep getting $50,000 a plate. Right. I mean, honestly, there's not a lot that I wouldn't say if you gave me $50,000.
Right.
Honestly, like, I'm pretty pro-Israel if there's $50,000 on the table.
Wow, controversial stuff from Brad Goertz here.
Some schmuck in Edmonton for hire.
And because you're in Edmonton, I wanted you to quote what he says about United Conservative Party leader and Premier in waiting Jason Kenney, and what Kenney said about what Kenney's relationship is with the media. I thought this was total bullshit too. Can you read from I Have a Little Doubt?
So I have little doubt in my mind that he will be the next premier. I'll give caution on one thing. He cannot be beaten by the NDP. The NDP is finished. They will not beat Jason Kenney. But the NDP is not the one who won the last election here. The media won the last election. The media elected the NDP, and the media is going to go out of their way to bring Jason and the party down. I've always seen Alberta's media as essentially leaning right. Like really leaning right. I don't kind of know. He sounds a bit like Trump, honestly. Like, is he getting sort of mush brain too?
Isn't he projecting some paranoia regarding his own relationship with his own, previous or present relationship with the national media?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I feel like that was the first time that there's a lot of talk about how he refused to talk to the media, or he was super tight, wasn't very, very open with the media. But I don't think you could make a rational argument that the media in Alberta had got the NDP elected.
Right, exactly. And anybody who's ever cracked open the Calgary Herald or the Edmonton Journal, who are both owned by Post Media as well as the Sun papers. And
Post Media now, it's all the Sun.
The four major papers in Alberta are all fucking put together in the same, not the same newsroom exactly, but it's kind of essentially the same editorial department. So he is being disingenuous there. Finally, Brad, here is Stephen Harper weighing in on being liked. He says, I was never in the job to be liked. I tell people I'm a cat person. If you're a cat person, you're used to not being liked. You're used to serving. I don't know if my cat really does like me or not. Brad, do you think Stephen Harper's cat likes Stephen Harper?
I got to admit, I have a lot of, I don't know if it's despair, like with that kind of cynicism that protects you from feeling vulnerable. But the one thing that I really believe is true is that every night, I think Stephen Harper's cat hops up on the bathroom sink and just kind of dips its butthole onto Harper's toothbrush. I guarantee you that's true.
Brad Goertz is a civil servant in Edmonton, Alberta, a woodworker, and I would describe you as a prairie hillbilly intellectual. You don't have any social media presence, do you?
I don't.
No, it's your website that shows your woodworking. Also, you built a canoe, correct?
I did build a canoe, and then it got broken.
Oh no! So what happened?
A guy driving in a parking lot ripped the back end of it off.
That sucks, dude. But hey, Brad, thank you for speaking with Unpacking the News.
Hey, you're welcome.
That's Unpacking the News for this week. Look for Jason Makusoff's Stephen Harper in his own words, and what on earth is Stephen Harper up to at macleans.ca. You can find me on Twitter at Andre Goulet. Unpacking the News is produced in Montreal. Subscribe to this show on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this show, support it at patreon.com/unpackingthenews. Check back here next week for episode 4 of Ricochet's French language podcast, Fil Rouge. This one's a conversation with Steve Gros-Louis of the Huron-Wendat Nation on how he uses dance as a way to pass down notions of identity and history to his community and to his kids. Until then, I'm Andre Goulet. Thanks for listening.